Let's say that I'm a comp artist and I'm getting assigned shots. Now I have 8 shots that I need to work on, and the shots are of me and Jonathan talking. There's a green screen behind us. It goes over his shoulder looking at me. There's the reverse of it. These are very similar shots. I don't need 8 Nuke scripts for this. This is a perfect example of where I would have all inside of a multi-shot script, because the tasks I'm going to be doing, the keying, it's going to be a variation on it. Any other corrections is going to be a variation from one shot to the next. So in that case, that sequence of shots, that's gold right there.
Hi, and welcome to the TD Meetup. My name is Alexander Richter. I'm a technical director for visual effects, animation, and games, and I work at companies like WeatherFX and Framestore on Avatar: The Way of Water and Monsters at Work.
Today, we want to talk about Nuke Multishot. And the idea here is, like with every TD meetup, we want to look into new technology, new elements for people who are interested in technology, for technical artists, technical director, and software developer. And I thought this was a great opportunity because we have the opportunity to talk with Foundry directly and look into their new features that can also cross-reference between the artistic and technical work. A part of a technical artist, technical director's work is to open the gates into a software for an artist to make them custom usable, because no software in the world can create something that works for everyone, for every studio at the same time, perfectly in sync with their own pipeline, with their own workflow. So it's always the job of every technical person to not only solve problems, but also create opportunities for artists to use the tool even better. New feature that Foundry is working in, that's coming out in Nuke 16, is the Multishot. And I thought this is a great opportunity to look exactly in this cross moment where something that is usually completely technical, completely Python and TD related now becomes more accessible to artists. And as always, I'm not alone. I'm joined today by Jonathan Ekstad, who is an architect at the Foundry, who has also worked for years on Multishot and other features. He has experience over 30 years in the industry and worked over 20 feature films as a compositor, supervisor, and production tool engineer. And he worked also at Digital Domain, where he worked on the 3rd generation of Nuke compositing itself. So he's very deeply embedded into Nuke itself. And he is one of the architects who created Multishot system, basically. And he will do also the introduction and talk a little bit about what was the thought behind and the whole idea. And the other person that is joining is Terry. He is also a compositor. As I feel like everyone's a compositor in Foundry, at least who's working at Nuke, which is always great. And he worked as a compositing supervisor, on set VFX supervisor, and he is especially leading the talent team, creative, and especially also the educational element and tutorial content. He will dive a little bit deeper into the details of Multishot and will explain how this works basically in detail. Let me give over to Jonathan.
Yeah, I was going to give a really quick background of Multishot, or the usage of Multishot in Nuke, and especially the background of it. Nuke was not designed to do Multishot. Nuke at Digital Domain was intended really for a single artist working on a single shot at a time. And so the idea of Multishot was not really thought about or considered in the fundamental design of the package. So it has some limitations. So the main goal of Multishot was how can we expand Nuke's capabilities to support what is now becoming a very common feature, which is artists are working on multiple shots in multiple sequences at a time, a single artist. And I spent 10 years at DreamWorks where I learned this. So I came out of visual effects at Digital Domain, typical visual effects production, and went into feature animation. And feature animation is very heavily sequence-based and multi-shot based. And it was a great learning experience for me, learning how artists work and lighters work in that environment. And I realized, oh my goodness, Nuke is missing a lot of features that it really needs. So that was a great learning experience for me. And it's wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to actually roll or put those features into Nuke as a core part of the product. Nuke 16 and in Nuke 15.2, which are in open beta right now, we have these new features. So to support Multishot, Nuke really needed to have the concept of inherited or scoped variables. So what we are calling graph scope variables. Nuke, up to this point, has had global variables, which are in TCL, TCL global variables. The problem with global variables is that they're global. So graph scope variables are going to allow you to do local overrides. We also have recursive variable evaluation, which means that the variables can expand using other variable content. We have a variable panel, which you can use to edit and control those variables, which you couldn't do before. A variable switch node, which allows you to decide which part of the script to switch to based on those variables. A variable group node, which will allow you to do localized variable environments. And finally, a command line renderer so that you can control these variables via the command line so that you can set shot sequence numbers, things like that. Initially, variables in Nuke, as I said, were just TCL variables. So if you're familiar with the script expression editor or the expression editor in a knob, you go to a floating point knob and you set an expression on it and you say, I want to reference the frame or the view or this arbitrary variable that I created, or a shot variable. You're accessing the TCL variables, and those are, as I said, global to every single node in the entire script. And so that presents a problem because you can't make subsections of the script have localized variable scope. And that, at Digital Domain, where we were working on a single shot at a time, that wasn't a problem. But as soon as you start working on multiple shots where a single script needs to work properly for multiple shots. In other words, you're switching the context of the script from shot 1 to shot 2, shot 3, shot 4, or you're changing the asset or whatever sequence. This can be a real challenge. So people started to use user knobs, which are floating point or color knobs that you can add to nodes. And they typically will build up control panels of variables using these user knobs. And these are knobs that you can reference from other expressions and other knobs and do things. So people typically have used that mechanism. This is a dedicated new variable panel where you can edit and visualize all your variables. And this is in the script settings panel. So this is a global thing that you can see all the variables available in the script at the same time. You can also look at what are inside each group inside of the script. This is all configurable via Python, so you can either do it manually, which we know that most multi-shot scripts or multi-shot environments can be very complex and can have many, many, many variables. So we're not expecting users to edit necessarily this. So this is all accessible and settable via Python. Recursive variable evaluation. One of the things about variables is they can be simple or they can be very complex. And when you're trying to create, say, a path, a file path using a bunch of variables like shot and sequence and asset and what have you, job, locations, you end up with these strings of a whole bunch of variables embedded into these strings. And so by using recursive evaluation, you can embed references to other variables within the contents of the variable or the evaluated value of the variable so that you can build up a more complex variable from a series of other variables, and then in your path just reference that single complex variable rather than having to build that string, that complex string, every single time in every single expression. So this is very handy, and it allows you to also build up the names of other variables to reference. So you can say, I have the names of the variables are customized per shot. So I want asset, shot 01 asset, shot 2 asset, shot 3 asset. And in an expression, I want to be able to reference the proper variable depending on what shot I'm on. So I need to build up the name of the variable I want to reference from the contents of another variable. The variable expressions will fall back to using environment variables. So if you have environment variables, which is very common, to control your job system, say your job, your shot, your sequence, if the variable evaluation doesn't find the name of the variable in its local environment, it will fall back to looking in the environment variables itself. And this can be very, very handy because it allows you to apply local overrides. So if I had a OCIO variable for example. That's set in the environment, but I wanted to locally override that in the script. I can define that local variable with the same name, and it will pick up that local variable. But if I remove that local variable, it will fall back to using the environment. All right, so there's multiple levels of inheritance happening. Variables panel is, again, this idea of a global control panel. So the idea of user knobs is something that is very common. People will use a node. They create a node, either like a no-op in the script, or they'll use the root control panel, and they'll add user knobs, and that gives them a single place for them to grab a menu, set a string for the job, for the shot, and it's like a control panel for the script. Right? And that's a very common thing people do. We're formalizing that. And so there's this new global panel called variables. And each of the variables, each of the GSV variables that you define can be lofted or exposed in this variable panel. And that you only have to do the ones that you want to do. So this is essentially an artist-facing tool. And so you want to expose the variables that you want the artist to be controlling, not necessarily every single variable that you're dealing with in the script environment. And then getting more into the artist's workflow, to be able to switch, if you want to have some custom variation between shot 1 and shot 2 and shot 3, you need to be able to specify, hey, I want to use this color correction for shot 1, but a different color correction for shot 2, different color correction for shot 3. And so you need a way to say which one to use. And the variable switch node is a way to do that. It allows you to specify the variable to reference, and what patterns, what values in that variable to switch to the different inputs. And it's more flexible than using the standard switch node. You can do this in the standard switch nodes, but it's very difficult to write the expressions to actually achieve it. So this is a way to simplify that and make it much more user-friendly. And then the variable group node. So as I mentioned earlier, the TCL variables that people have traditionally used, or the user knobs, are more of a global scope. In other words, every single node in the script shares the same evaluation, the variable evaluation scope. And oftentimes you want to be able to have one chunk of the script be at a different scope or a different context than another part of the script. And to achieve that, we've introduced the variable group node, which is just a group. The thing about the group is that you can define additional variables, GSV variables, on that group, and they will automatically inherit their values from their parent group. And if you've defined the same variable in that group that is present on the parent, the child group will override the parent value. So maybe a good example for that is a frame range. You need to set a frame range. The script has a global frame range, and now my shot group has a different frame range, and I can specify the same frame variable in my local group, give it a new value, and now it overrides the one globally. And then all the nodes within that group share that new environment. So they will evaluate in that localized environment. And groups can be within groups, can be within groups. So you can build up a hierarchy of evaluation. And then finally, there's the ability to set these variables externally. So when you start up, when you go to execute Nuke on a render farm, you want to be able to set what these values of the variables are. So you want to be able to set what shot am I executing, what sequence am I executing. And this is a way for you to pass in the values of the variables via the command line. And that's about it for the quick overview. I'm going to hand it off to Terry to get into more of a detailed explanation and a little bit of a live demo.
Thanks, Jonathan. I learn something new every time I hear you talk. So let me go ahead and select my screen. Okay, so before I get into it, I just want to note that the Nuke 16 and 15.2 open beta is now available. So everything we talk about today, if you want to give it a try, and if you are a studio that is on the 15 series and want to continue with it, you'll be able to use Multishot in 15.2, as well as for 16. So definitely a great way to get your hands on it. Let's jump into and sort of follow up about everything that Jonathan just talked about. So We now have an explanation, understanding a concept of Multishot and why it is created. And if you think about the last project you worked on or a project that you're going to be working on, think about how things are set up. Think about shot assignment. Think about a complex sequence and really how things are templated throughout from shot to shot. Now, keep in mind the consolidation of scripts, removing duplication, taking 5 scripts, making it to 1. So kind of keep your mind frame in that. So let's look at all the different components that Jonathan just went through, and we'll see the visuals inside of Nuke corresponding to that. So there is the variables tab, and that's located in your project settings. So this is the hub for all of the variables that you're going to be creating. This is the variables panel, so we can promote the variables onto there, and we can remove a lot of the noise if we don't want to see all those variables. Say you're an artist and you're working on it, you're just going to be concerned with some of them, and that's where you would find them. There is the variable switch, variable group, and as Jonathan mentioned, so we can define variables from them or create local overrides for that group. There is the GSV live group. So think of this as a live group that is variable enabled, or we can do the same, define and create overrides. The link node, which is great for shot overrides. This is designed with Multishot in mind, but I mean, you can use it just generally. And then there's the group view. So same thing like the link nodes. This is designed with Multishot in mind, but of course you can use it as a part of Nuke. So now we're going to start with the basics, and we're going to use very simple colors here just so we can see a clearer visual difference as we go through this. So the first thing we're going to do is create a variable, and we'll call it shot. Now we're going to grab our constants and create a variable switch, and we want to talk to that variable we just created. So from the properties, we're going to choose shot, and we're going to create a pattern. We're going to call it red, green, and blue. Now back in our variables tab, what we're going to do is put the value to green. And then we see that the variable switch has now changed, and so on and so forth. So now think about this variable switch, and let's say there's 30 other variable switches. When we change that value, they're all going to change. Now, we can create a list version because the default is a string and we've typed in that value, but maybe we want a list of strings. And this will make switching a little bit easier. So in this case, we're going to type red, green, blue. Now, this time when we select the value, you notice we'll have a pop-up and where we can change that value so we can have quick access. So depending on the type of value that is in there, we may want to list rather than a string. Now, as you begin to work with variables, and let's say you have a standard set as a studio or an individual that you do for every sequence, shot, whatever the case is, you might have quite a few inside of there. And this is where the variables panel comes into play. So let's look at sort of the basics of this. We have that shot variable that we created, and then we have our variables panel. So all we need to do is enable the little eye feature, so the visibility. Boom, and then it pops up onto our variables panel. This means that we don't need the project settings anymore. We can access that variable directly from the variables panel, and we can dock that panel wherever makes the most sense for us or the style that we work in. And it's completely editable. So this means that we can go in, we can shuffle things around as far as the layout, add dividers, and that way we can have something, again, that's sort of standardized, maybe the order of the way that we like things to appear. We can go in and modify that. Now, the variables group is capable of doing a couple things. So first, let's look at creating a local override. So we grab those constants and switch, we create a variable group. You'll notice in its properties, we have access to the variables, and we're going to change that value from red to blue. So one thing you notice is that we get a little yellow icon, and this means that we've created an override for this. Now, if we look back in the variables tab in our project settings, you'll see in the root, we have our shot variable that we created. And then we've created our variables group. And within there, we've done an override to the shot variable, and we can see that yellow icon. So everything is nicely organized inside of our variables tab. Another thing that we can do is define variables from here. So same thing, this time, what we're going to do is just have a little setup here with some different grades. And then we are going to add a variable. So we're going to add a variable, and then we're going to call it grade and give it some patterns. Now, what we've done here is we've created a local override. So every other switch is still going to be that red, except this group. We've overridden the value, well, in this case, actually to red. And we've also created a grade variable that is associated with this variable group. And we can see everything is nicely nested and organized in the variables tab. Now, another example of a variable group, something we can do with it is add a level, so we can nest inside of a variable group, another variable group. So in this case, we have 5 shots that we're working on. Each of them are in a variable group, and this allows us to define variables that are specific to this shot or do overrides. Now, all of these 5 shots are in another group called sequence, where again, if this sequence has particular overrides or variables that we want associated with it, we can go down in levels for it. So in this case, we're going to grab a script. If you're familiar with live groups, you'll know that it's a great way to share scripts and share portions of a script. In other words, we're pulling in the matte painting from this plate that another artist did. So quite a big build on it. But from here, you'll see that when we select the properties for the live group, we have access to variables as well. So there is a variables tab. We can see everything that's listed within the script. And if we wanted to make some overrides or changes, we can make the live group editable. And that way we could go in and define variables or create overrides. Any variables that were created during the creation of this live group will come along for the ride as well. Let's look at what a common setup for, let's say we're building out variables from scratch, and we're going to do it manually here. A common setup that we might want to use across all of the projects we're working on. So it might be something like a show name, the show root, which is a path of the project, where the plates live. And since we've defined the show root, we can just use the subpath so we can append it later on. Same thing for the CG. And we can continue to add some fundamental root values that we think that would be useful in the project. So sort of a standardized set that we're always using, especially variables that we think we're going to be calling on. And you'll notice for some of the variables that same syntax that you might be using in your read notes are also valid here. So we can also make variable sets, and that's that little folder icon. So think of a variable set as a basic grouping mechanism for related variables. So what that means is, let's say we make a variable set, and we're going to call this one shot 10 plate. So now what we're going to nest under this is anything that is associated with this plate, a variable that we think is important that we're going to be needing, and we're going to call on a later time. So in this case, it's the name. It's the real name. We might have the frame range for this particular plate, even defining it, but what type. So scope, it's a shot. So anything that we might want to call on, and we can associate it for this particular plate. And this keeps us really organized in our variables tab because we can be doing grouping. You'll notice with this is because of the way that we have things set up, and we'll look at this in a minute, is the file path for this particular plate is talking to a variable. So you can see the syntax %plate. Now, how we have this script set up, that means if we change shots, we only have a single read node, but the plate path is switching. So when we switch, we get another plate path, and so the shot changes. And then same thing for the CG. So both of these are using a single read. And as we switch the shot variable, both paths get changed. That was a manual way. We may want to be doing that every time. And this is essentially what you would be, ideally in the long run, is that you'd be automating a big portion of the, sort of fundamental or the root variables if they don't have to be customized on a particular show or particular sequence that you're working on. So in this case, the Python script, you have a menu at the top. And as we do that, we create out this standard set of variables. And we can go as crazy with that as we want. So Jonathan mentioned recursive evaluation of variables. So this is just a fundamental understanding of what's that means. So in this case, we have a variable called color, and its value is red. And what we're going to do is create another variable, and we'll call this variable result. Now for its value, we want to type in %color, because what we want for this variable is to get the value of the variable called color. Now we also have a text node's properties up here, and what we want to do is talk to the variable called result. Now once we do that, we get the word red in the viewer from our text node, because in essence what we're doing here is we are talking to result. Result is talking to color because we want that value red, and this is really sort of the essence of what a recursive variable is. So if we look at some of the paths here, maybe let's look at plate. We can see that we're talking to show root, which is this path here. We're then appending plate root to it, which is this path here. And then we want to get the value of this shot variable. And this one changes, right? Because this is a drop down. We're going to change it from shot to shot to shot. And what we want to do is talk to this variable set. And if this value changes, to be dynamic and change as well. And that means that that's how we're able to get that path changing and having that single read. So there's quite a few examples of how you can be taking advantage of the recursive variables. This is just one of them. Expressions. So you'll notice that this merge is disabled, but if we switch to a particular shot, all of a sudden it is enabled. So how this is done is if we look at the properties for the disabled knob and edit the expression, there is a string compare here, and we're talking to the variable called shot. So when shot 40 comes up to play, it disables or enables. Now think about if you are in a situation where you have a working nodes and then render nodes. In other words, a defocus that might be very heavy that you don't want calculating as you're just working through it, and you have a fast version of it. You can be using this type of approach for something like that, right? And when it comes time to render, then we use the render ready version of them. And then there's the link node. So this is a brand new node. It's lovely. Again, this was designed with Multishot in mind, but can be used in other areas as well. So what we'll do here is we have this node that say is the parent, and we're going to copy it as a link. So this is different than some people might be, creating a copy of it and an expression linking all the knobs except for the one that they want to override. Well, this allows you to do overrides natively more efficiently than having a ton of clones as well. So what we do is we paste this as a link, and then we're going to create an override for one of the attributes. So we go ahead and select, I think in this case, we'll just pick multiply. Notice the yellow icon letting us know which knob is overridden, and then we can go and make an adjustment to that. Now, the original stays in place, and then we have the override on multiply as well. So think about this for shot overrides. So in this case, working on a couple of shots. They're generally the same grade. They start off very similar. So we link those nodes across, and then we go in and specifically do overrides on those knobs where we know we need to change things. So great way to work. Now, let's just look at different layouts of how you may be approaching things. Let's say you don't work with groups at all and everything is exposed at the root level. Well, this would be an example of that. So we have variables set up for this project. We can switch our shots in this case, amongst other things. And we have variable switches that are templated throughout the shot. But how this is laid out is on the right-hand side is everything that's contributing to the environment. And now if there is a one-off when we switch the shots, we can go in, do the compositing work. It joins back together with a variable switch. This is everything that is contributing to the hero for shot 1. And then this is everything that's contributing for shot 2. This is an example of a completely grouped graph at the root level. So we see that everything is contained within a group as we're working through this. And as we switch shots here, notice the highlighted noodle will switch. So we're seeing how we're traversing through the node graph here. Now, this is where the group view comes into play, because if we think about how we want to template things out, if we were going to take this approach, we can pop up. And what's lovely is we can do work at the group view level. We can add a viewer. We can make modifications to anything inside of here, or preferred, you can use it regularly and jump it to a tab specified for the group. We can change which side it pops up on, left or right. This is especially useful when you are templating or as you're working. And this is the group view portion. So now let's look at now you probably wouldn't lay out a multi-shot script like this, but this is just sort of everything, the whole kitchen sink in one. So pretty heavy shot here, and we can see everything that's highlighted that's contributing to the viewer. And if we switch the shot, then we'll see everything else that is contributing at this point. And really what this is about is there is variable switches that are templated throughout the script. There is variable groups. So we're doing some local overrides from certain sections, shot specific elements like this torch smoke that is exposed at the root level, utilizing those expressions throughout the script that toggle on and off depending on what shot we're on. Common elements like volumes and particles that have separate setups going through switches. We have single reads. So the hero in this shot, this T-Rex, as a single read, but it uses different light mixing per shot. So splits out and then joins back together. And then some 3D in here. So there's some geometry as well as cameras that push through a switch depending on what shot. And then the variables panel. So in this case, we've added an attribute, a finite attribute of snow. There's just 4 different levels for it that they can adjust. That's all we're dealing with. And then a lot of those quick toggles. So fast to focus, motion blur, camera shake, lens distortion, everything that has a heavy operation, we can quickly toggle as an artist on and off, whatever is necessary. Now, if we think about this from a sequence fix, this happens all the time. So in this case, the T-Rex's eyes needed to be re-rendered and then recomposited. Well, we have a variable that addresses that exactly. And then utilizing groups or live groups, the matte painting portion, another artist worked on it, and we're bringing it in as a live group as it contributes to the final result of the shot. Now, don't just think about sequences and shots, because there are quite a few companies that work with product visualization as well. And they have a ton of variations that they need to address. And so this is a perfect example of where a multi-shot comes into play, because we have a still that we're delivering, or multiple stills, multiple angles, or even videos, but they need so many variations. So we can set up and template out something that we could be using, from project to project that addresses all of these. So this means that we can go in, we can switch, make all those adjustments, and really reduce the bulk overhead from the comp side of things. And as Jonathan mentioned, that we can then render all those graph scope variables, all those variations. We can set up a render that will render all of them. So this is an example here where this is a shot-based example, but from here, just built a simple submission script. It is addressing the GSVs, and then we're sending 20 shots to render on the farm, all with one submission, which is great. So multi-shot graph scope variables. Remember, it's called multi-shot, but that is only really one aspect of the feature set. You think about optimizing complex sequence, shot-based templates. It really is a lovely new workflow being introduced into Nuke. So with that, let me open up Nuke here, and we'll just go and manually build out a few things. So first, I just want to thank Andre Feeks, super talented artist, works at ILM in London, and he provided a big chunk of a project he's worked on. It's a personal project called We Hunt Giants. So you can watch it on YouTube. It's a very cool and a ton of work. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is we have these 3 shots. And here is our variables tab. So what we're going to do is let's go in and create the new variable, and we'll call it shot. So now we're going to grab our 3 footages, and we'll create a variable switch. And we want to talk to that one that we just created. So we'll pick a shot, and let's give it a pattern. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now we want to have a value for these. We have the ability to do a string, but we know we want the string list or list. So let's put in as our menu items 1, 2, 3. So this means now, when we look through this, we can go in and change the value from 1 to 3, and the shots will change accordingly. Great. So we've set up our first variable, and we have the switch that's talking to it. So now let's do another one. So what we'll do is we'll create let's create a grade node, and think of this as the parent grade node that we want, because what we're going to do is actually link it out. So I'll create some links for it, and then we're going to hook it up to the switch. Now, one thing to note and to keep care of is what inputs we are plugging into what number, because remember, these correspond to the patterns that we're putting here. So what is in 0 is over here. So maybe just for organization's sakes, I would just do it this way here. And then we have our grade nodes. Okay, so let's first look at the grade, and actually this one. And what we'll do is we're just going to change something that we want to affect all. So we're just going to increase the white level a bit just to remove some of those highlights. And then for grade 2, let's change, we're going to create an override, and we're going to change the multiply, and we'll just add some blue into it. And then for the center one, what we'll do is, again, create an override to multiply. And then maybe this one is going to be more towards the warm tone. And then lastly, for our 3rd grade, we'll again override that multiply, and then go ahead and maybe just put some green into it so it's visibly different. Back in our variables tab, let's create a new one. We'll call this one grade. And then we're going to grab our grades, and then we'll create a variable switch. And the pattern we want to talk to is called grade, and we'll just do A, B, C for demonstration sakes. And then our variable switch, we want the type to be a list, and we're going to edit it to A, B, C. Great. So now we've set up a couple of variables. We have different values for them as well. And then this way we can go in and then begin to promote these variables. So this means that we can open up our variables tab panel, which I have ready, and then we'll go and turn them on directly from here. So one thing, last thing I'll show here is that, yes, we can go in and we can organize and lay this out differently, but also we can do some handy things. Let's say we go into the edit for the grade, we can give it a label. So let's, instead of grade, I want it to show up on our variables panel as LUT. And for the tooltip, I'll just put something simple, change grade. Changes grade on here. And when I click away, notice that we have it updated. So in our variables tab, it is called grade. In our variables panel, it's called LUT. Now, the nice thing is you don't have to worry about, oh, well, geez, which one goes with which, because when we hover over, it's telling us that it's a root variable called grade is where this is coming from. And it also has the tooltip that we added inside of there. Okay, so with that, hopefully everyone has a clear understanding and a little bit more of a hands-on and more of a broad scope on how to get started with Multishot.
Thank you very much. Always a great thing to see how this plays out. And obviously, we now transition to the Q&A. So let me start with a question that we had on LinkedIn. Can we train with Nuke Multishot on the NC version? Just trying to automate what I can.
If I take that question, maybe train wasn't the exact word that they meant to say, or if they meant to say, can you use? It
was just educational, like you're learning Multishot, I think is the.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it is. So not yet, because Nuke 16 and 15.2 is not out yet, but once the non-commercial version gets updated, then at that point.
If I would summarize it basically as exposing environment variables to the user and integrating it deeper into Nuke system, especially with things like expressions, because like with environment variables, you cannot do it as easily. You need to, open environment variables. But basically, it's Multishot is environment variables that you have visibly into the system. You have this kind of showing lists and stuff like that. And at the same time, you have basically key elements, like now you can just access them directly. You have nodes that access them directly, basically. Is that a good way to summarize that?
Yes, basically, to kind of get to the reasoning or the idea behind the design, because as you can see, this isn't necessarily like a completely built workflow. Like this isn't intended to be like ready to go, and if you've got you got multiple shots, then you start Nuke up in multi-shot mode, and it's all configured for you to work with multiple shots. That's the design, or the intention behind this system is to give the tools to you to be able to build your own custom multi-shot workflows. And the reason why we did that is because a lot of companies already do this. A lot of companies already have a lot of tooling. I can speak from experience. A lot of Python tooling, a lot of environment, job management tooling to handle this. And to date, they've kind of had to do it in a clunky way using the existing tools that were in Nuke, which were not designed for this kind of purpose. And so really, this is like a Lego kit. We're giving you the Lego pieces that you need to build your own multi-shot workflows, and we're hoping that the companies that already rely on multi-shot workflows will be migrating to these native tools, and will be able to deprecate a lot of their own custom tooling that they've had to build to do these kinds of things. One of the key pieces of it is we try to look for patterns. Like some people want to take a single script, a single graph, and say, I want that single graph to work for shot 1, now shot 2, now shot 3, now shot 4, now shot 5, right? And then other companies have wanted to say, I want to have multiple graphs in the same script for shot 1 and shot 2 and shot 3 and shot 4, and we want them all present in the same graph. And so there's a lot of different ways people work in what they call multi-shot. So the word multi-shot is overloaded. To everybody, it means a different thing. And everyone has a different way of working. And so really, we didn't want to try to impose a particular kind of workflow on people. We wanted to be able to give you the tools to build your own workflow that works the best the way your artists want to work. Mentally, it was really the graph state, those graph state or graph scope variables was a fundamental piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, so basically, to some degree, you removed a piece of pipeline that everyone basically has to create,
yes.
And especially exposing things that are normally hidden. That, I think, is always a big problem when it comes to environment variables, for example, that you open a shot in a pipeline and then there's hundreds of environment variables that are pushed into the system. And for an artist or even like a TD, you literally have to print them out or to look for them and to understand what's going on in the background, what can I access, where I am, or you need to build a tool that represents you that basically. So I think that is like removing the hidden factor, even for artists who sometimes maybe have to solve a problem. Maybe they open a shot and there's some complication going on and it has something to do with the environment variable because it was the wrong one for some reason. At least they have something of an exposure of looking at it and finding it instead of like literally being like, okay, I need to ask a TD to print out what's going on with the shot or whatever.
That's exactly right. Yeah, TCL, for example, there was no way to visualize the TCL variables. You had to literally pull up a shell and query in a command line environment the values of the TCL variables. So it's very much a hidden thing, and so that is why people tended to use user knobs as a way to have something that the artists are familiar with and are comfortable with. So this is the kind of the beginning of our multi-shot journey. We have other features and other capabilities that we want to continue to add to. This is kind of the first set of features, the fundamental set of features. And one of the things that we know people are frustrated and confused by is TCL and the expression syntax of TCL, which is TCL is a very old expression language, and it has some very weird syntax to it, and it's very, very old school. And so just to do a standard string compare, like you want to compare two string values, you can't just simply say is A equal to B. You can't do that. You have to say string compare A, B. And it's just so different from other expression languages, modern expression languages, that it's very difficult to artists to figure out what to type into these expressions. And so one of the future projects that we're working on is to give a better expression experience. So we know that that is a pain point for people.
Yeah, at the same time, I think the expressions are pretty important for a certain level of, even for artistic work, because they simplify things. And now you basically, with the multi-shot, you created a higher necessity to know at least an expression level thing, because maybe less need for Python pipeline because of the multi-shot, but more need for expression elements or understanding or something like that. So you shifted the weight a little bit, maybe away from Python to TCL to some degree, depending on how people work, basically.
Exactly.
Awesome. We have a few questions here. Luca, in the example that you just built, how would you implement a per shot LUT into the variable stack? Is this a step toward a file structure similar to USD?
To the second part, I don't think so, but Jonathan might have different thoughts on that. But the most straightforward way of a per shot LUT, let's say you're using an OCAO CDL transform or something, somehow you're pointing at a LUT, then you would just could have, let's say, 3 of those nodes plugged into a variable switch. The variable switch is also talking to the shot variable. So as soon as the shot switches, the LUT will switch to the appropriate variable.
This is something that we're currently working on, is making sure that from a global standpoint, the script is able to switch its OpenColor.io environment, for example, using the multi-shot variables. That's one thing that we are aware of and working on. But if you have a actual LUT file, for example, then you can be building that path using the variables. So that's one way of doing it.
The next question is from Rupert. Can I put a variable into a read node path and then use one read node to read in the plate for any shot?
Yeah, so that was one of the examples showed as it worked through that. There's a lot of information there, so not surprised that maybe not everybody's catching everything. Be good to take a look again. But yeah, absolutely. So all the different definition of the paths for the plates. are all being called through the variable. And so every time we were switching the shots, then the plate to the path was switching, which in turn is, getting one read node to read the plate for any shot.
Obviously, you have to plan ahead for that, and your file structure has to be built in a multiple shot or in a cohesive way, so that those variables can be easily used to switch the paths. You can even get more complex and use variable sets to have custom paths per shot, and then reference a variable set by name, and then find a custom path that could be, say, outside the bounds of your normal path structure.
In your example that you showed, you brought whole sequences into one Nuke script. Is that a little bit also the idea that because usually you have one shot per Nuke script, which to some degree has the benefit of, you can distribute it, obviously, artist shot in a way, but this allows you to create this, 10 shots in one script, and using, for example, things like a multi-shot to switch between the functionalities and the settings and whatever. Is that a little bit the idea here, like as a, or
yes.
was it just because, like, a little bit also was it just because it was an example and easy to show? Or is it actually the idea of combining sequences in one Nuke script, basically?
That's just it. As I mentioned, everybody works differently. So that is, I can speak from personal experience that some artists do want to work with multiple shots in the same script itself. So they want to have chunks of script that are for shot 1, shot 2, and they want to have it all live. That obviously has some scalability issues. Obviously, if you had 100 shots, you're going to have, those are a lot of nodes, and there's going to be management problems. But say you had a reasonably sized sequencer, 5 to 10 shots, you could theoretically have all the nodes for that in a single script. So people do want to work that way, and then other people think that's not scalable, and they want to have a single script that changes state for the different shots. And usually for those instances, you need to have a script that's able to go up different branches. So I need to have customizations, right, for one shot. And that's where the variable switch comes in. And that's where some of these newer concepts that we're going to be introducing come in a little bit later, to allow you to manage those kind of variations, those node variants, more easily. Other people want to do is they want to be able to build scripts which are essentially assembly scripts. So rather than each of the script chunks being a complex, a whole comp, for example, maybe it's just a read, and you're trying to do assembly, like a sequence assembly, shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, shot 4, shot 5, and you're trying to blend or do mixing or some kind of wiping between those shots. And in those circumstances, you do want each of those reads to be able to have different shot names, different frame ranges, those kinds of things, knowing what their offsets are in the global sequence. And using these hierarchical groups, you can set up essentially final assembly. There's another word I'm trying to think of for that. So that's another option. So it's not necessarily about doing the entire comp, it's be able to manage those kind of complex editorial sequences more easily.
More food for thought on something like this, and when might be extremely, maybe it's obvious to use, is let's say that I'm a comp artist and I'm getting assigned shots. Now I have 8 shots that I need to work on, and the shots are of me and Jonathan talking. There's a green screen behind us. It goes over his shoulder looking at me. There's the reverse of it. These are very similar shots. I don't need 8 Nuke scripts for this. This is a perfect example of where I would have all inside of a multi-shot script, because the tasks I'm going to be doing, the keying, it's going to be a variation on it. Any other corrections is going to be a variation from one shot to the next. So in that case, that sequence of shots, that's gold right there. Now my next shot, shot 9, is of a building exploding. Well, in that case, I'm not going to make that a part of that Nuke script with all of those shots. Maybe doing a one-off for that particular one and using it as a single shot.
I was actually thinking, like, from a pipeline perspective, is maybe to create like a sub-shot situation where you would have maybe from one perspective, like, you see Jonathan in 4 shots, that would be one Nuke script, and then Terry in the other, that would be for another Nuke script. And because then there's literally the same, like, it's not even like different lighting situation or whatever, it's literally the same shot, just 5 seconds later or whatever. And so you can build a structure where, because the problem is the normal cases is you need to create templates, basically. You need to create scripts to transport or import or whatever, like, hey, I created this shot, and then you now have to create scripts or ways to copy paste this settings with the changes of the, the different shot input and so on. But in this case, you can just have one script, assign it to one artist, which is very realistic also, and then say, just here is a few variables and just go through it. And then you have to some degree less management, because now you don't have to manage 4 shots. There's less chance of 4 shots being different by accident, fixing one, forgetting to fix another one, and so on and so forth. So I feel like that is definitely something where I see them, like, on one side, very complex projects maybe get a little bit of a problem to divide it easily. But imagine, like, if you would work on a smaller scale, for example, like, you maybe have like 10 compositing artists and they can divide very easily. Then I think that is actually like much easier to divide using that, where you can just clump things better together for one artist versus every artist has to open a new script and set it up and all the things, basically.
That's exactly it. And as Jonathan mentioned earlier, is having multi-shot in mind as you do shot grouping and then shot assigning, you can really fully utilize the strength of it.
The next one is from Matt. Could you use this as a starting point for multiple artists working across a sequence? Is this only for a single user to manage a sequence of their own sequence? I imagine passing it to multiple artist scripts could break things. I think that's kind of related.
I think that's where nodes like the live group come into play, where say you have a sequence lead artist who perhaps set up the sequence using a single script for, say, 10 shots, and they got the sequence working with 10 shots, but they know that each of those shots in the sequence will require a shot artist to go in and then do changes. But as a sequence lead, they likely want to keep control of some of the global aspects of it, like global color corrections, global grades, and that's where the live group comes in. So they would set up live groups in those places that then get shared with all the subscripts. So what they would typically do, and at least in my experience, is the sequence lead would start with one script that works for all 10 shots, and then when they're done and ready to go to shot artists, that script gets copied, right, to each local shot, and now each of those local shot scripts are kind of localized, and if you're not careful, you have to then either manually copy changes to all 10 of them, or if you set up live groups, those live groups are shared between all 10 scripts. And so if you publish a change to that live group as a sequence lead, then the next time the artist updates that live group, all the shots will then get updated with that new script. You do have to think ahead, though. Obviously, if you didn't do that and you simply copied all the scripts locally, you're going to have to go back in later to each of those 10 scripts and then add in the places where you want those updates to be. So you do have to think ahead when you're doing these workflows.
It definitely gives you the opportunity of, not manually touching everything. Like if you set it up correctly, then you have the opportunity of creating a reference versus a pure import, basically.
Exactly.
Thanks for the presentation. Do you have any tips to share? Anything you found particularly useful or something that worked really well using Multishot? And on the opposite side, are there any pitfalls we should be aware of? Can you bash your own creation, Jonathan?
Yes, I mean there are certainly the challenge with the current system is it is somewhat technical. As an artist going into it, it may feel overwhelming. So while we have added some of the artist-facing tools, it's still you do have to have a good concept of how Multishot works, is going to work for your sequence. This does take a bit of experience to understand where to place the expressions, how to build the expressions to get the most out of the system. The feature animation is a great example. So you have you have in many visual effects movies these days it's almost like feature animation, right? You've got thousands and thousands of shots with almost fully CG environments. So once you have those kinds of environments where you've got multiple shots that share the same rendered environments, that all have a shared naming convention, those kinds of things, the same assets. So a big battle scene that is always going to have the same set of characters. This is where Multishot is really show its power, is that you'll be able to set up scripts that are able to manage those assets in a very easy way, because as long as you set it up properly, you then can switch between shots, and as long as you've set up the switches properly, your assets will automatically switch back and forth. So this shot doesn't have Captain America in it, but this shot does. You'll be able to set up switches to be able to handle those assets, and that's really the intention behind it, is those kind of sequences that have repetitive assets that you constantly see. Obviously, if it's a film project, and every single shot in a sequence has a different name or a different reel and different characters, and there's no particular commonality between the shots in the sequence, then Multishot's going to be, probably won't work so well in those examples.
To quote Bertrand from our TD Meetup,
USD is so damn flexible that you can see the worst thing ever being made without knowing, because USD is never going to complain. Like, USD is magic. It never complains about anything, even if you do the worst thing.
So I think that is the same for the Multishot, because the idea is a lot of similarities I can see here. And the biggest problem is, as you mentioned, like in the beginning, it could be overwhelming, and it is also about the right setup. If you don't do the right setup, maybe you will miss the reference element, basically, or if you don't do the right setup, then you have to constantly add new variables and adjust constantly, which means basically you maybe have some benefits, but not the full benefit, because you constantly have to scramble to add and update everything to keep it basically on the same scale. So I think the system encourages to have a better planning in the beginning, because then it allows you to reap the benefits much more, versus you did some basics, and then you decide, oh, there's this and this and that, and then you end up need to add it to all the previous scripts and stuff like that, basically.
And the reality of production is that if you're a small company with a handful of artists, this may not get you much, right? If you've got a handful of artists and each of those artists are managing their shots, it may not be worth the effort for you to set up the scripts and set up the variables and all that complexity. Whereas with medium to large size companies who have a lot of artists working on shots simultaneously, or they have a single artist working on a lot of common shots simultaneously, those people will likely see the biggest benefits to these new tools.
Which again comes back to USD, which is probably the same feature, because USD also is such a, for small studios, it's oftentimes, especially if it's not standard now, it's still a big hurdle to integrate it, and the level of complexity is just higher than just export it in the default format and so on. So I think it's a little bit a similar kind of relationship to both individuals.
The good thing is, by the way, that's if you ignore the variables, that some of the new tools like the link node, some of the new tools that we're introducing, some of the new nodes that we're introducing will actually just help in general. The group view, for example, some of those features will help artists just in their general workflow. Even though they were targeted for Multishot, they'll still be very useful in general workflows as well.
Rafael has the next question. At some point, the scripts get finalized individually, and everyone has mega complex text scripts at the end of the show. I guess that a tool that strips down the script to only contain the single shot might be useful. Any ideas how to cope with this?
So I think what he's asking is then, let's say we're in a certain, we have certain variables set up that are giving us our end result in the viewer, and a way to extract that state into, rather than stripping away, but maybe you export a copy of this new script with the way the variables are set up and
I think so, yeah.
Baking the strings. Yes, that has been brought up. We don't have a plan for that right now. but that is definitely something that's been raised as a desire. Like you want to be able to export, you want to save the script, but baked. So all the string variables, like in every read, for example, has the string expanded and baked into it rather than having any of the variables left in it. So yes, we're aware of that. We're not sure when we'll be able to get to that kind of feature.
It's part of the triage.
Yes.
And then another question from Rafael. The preview pop-up inside a group feature looks great and might end the war between artists who love or hate groups. Studios that have developed live backdrop nodes. Can this feature be pinned open or nodes in the group be selected from the preview?
Yeah, it pops open. So there's a little plus button on the group now, and then it actually stays open unless you hit the minus. So pinned or popped, it stays open. And absolutely, you can go in, select the nodes, add new nodes inside of there, connect viewers. So yeah, it's fully versatile.
It won't stop the battle between the artists. Maybe it's adding fuel.
It can always hope,
fuel to the fire.
So it's a new discussion. There's a new forum about the other battle now. There's a question from Torna. To extend on that question from previous about read node paths and stuff, can any string from any knob read the variable? Like in Houdini, you can have a path like root sequence at shot exr. So the variable can be used alongside regular strings in any knob like a read path.
Yes, with an asterisk. There are a few string knobs, for example, on the root panel, the project settings panel that currently you're not able to set an expression on. But any string where you're able to set an expression, which is almost every string in Nuke, you can encode a reference to a GSV.
Awesome. My final question is, you mentioned something in the beginning where on one side, as for example, Terry showed, you can add all the variables by hand, but you kind of indicated that is probably not the most common way. It's probably still Python related. Is that, would you, besides maybe if you have a very small project, which to some degree maybe doesn't make sense. So would you say basically, where's the connection? Where does Python start and where does Multishot basically kind of take over to some degree, or like where's the connection exactly between Python and Multishot here?
Well, in general, if you're a medium to large size company, you have some kind of job management system already. So the artist will log into a shot or log into a sequence. Well, you log into a shot usually. And with that, they log into the job and the sequence, and so they somehow get into the environment where they're going to be working in. And usually part of that pipeline-y workflow will set variables either in the environment variable or during the startup of Nuke, you'll be setting variables so that Nuke has access to that environment that the artist has worked in. That is usually where this kind of thing would be set up. So you would hook into that startup process of Nuke to populate these variables using that environment. I don't want to speak for every company, but I would think this is a fairly common thing that people need to do. Otherwise, you would have to have some kind of interactive thing where the artist like pulls up some kind of interface or some kind of dialogue and says, okay, now I'm in this job, this shot, this sequence. But the same thing applies. You're likely interacting with some kind of pipeline process to configure their working environment, because they need to have all the read paths, or they need to know the source paths to all their files. They need to know the output paths, whether that's all the asset management that goes along with it. So again, if you're a single company or you're a small company with a small number of artists and you're generally not working in a pipeline-y kind of fashion, then that's probably not so big a deal for you. But for most medium to large size companies, they'll have a lot of this tooling existing already. And obviously, you don't want the artist to be manually entering these variables
one by one. Yeah, you heard it, folks. So we still need Python. It's still not that, even with Multishot and AI. So I always mention it, but we always do Python for new courses. So everyone who's interested, and again, you can combine it with something like Multishot. And I think that is also why I wanted to talk with you, Jonathan and Terry, because I think what I love about the Multishot idea and execution is basically that it exposes and makes it a little bit more artist and even TD friendlier, because it allows things to be more like the input now from an artist or a technical artist can be higher, because they now can literally say, hey, I have an idea, here is how it looks like. Hey, what can I access, or can you add this? Because they can touch it. It's not hidden in an environment variable. It's something, it's literally variable. It's literally nodes that you can use. It's literally variables that they can see and access and modify. And maybe again, like an artist can create this by hand, and then this can be translated by Python for the whole, future thing. Like a supervisor creates a template, creates these variables, and then a pipeline TD or TD can translate it. So yeah, highly recommend it. Still, again, not dead. So Python still exists for the world. Also, we have a new thing coming next month, which is Python Copilot. So again, we are using what life gives us. So if life gives us lemons in terms of AI, we will try to make some lemonade, because it actually is helpful, even though it's not the world as people promise it. So you're welcome to check it out if you can find it on the website. Also, if you are interested in future TD Meetup, check out the newsletter. We always notify about future events. Next month, we will have Python Copilot. In March, we will have open source pipeline Plex, which to some degree, again, comes back to Multishot, because if you work on a pipeline, that's something where you can think about, hey, how much should I invest into adding Multishot? How much should I invest into adding USD and so on? That's all from ShotGrid to whatever, basically all important. Also, we are just having created a survey, so you can find it in the chat. There's a survey link. Happy to hear your opinion, how you like the TD Meetup, if you have ideas for future events and so on. And that would be always great to hear, so you can add that there. Terry, Jonathan, do you have any final words for this presentation? Anything you would like to give into the world, especially because of the release? Maybe something about how people can maybe start with it as a good first exercise to get into it, because I feel like, again, I see the relationship a little bit with USD in terms of something that potentially can start to be like, hey, it's nice that you know about Multishot and you can use it. If you are a compositor who has at least a basic understanding of it, I think that's not a bad thing to some degree. So anything that you would recommend when they are ready to check it out, like how they can basically get into it?
I'll let Terry kind of give the details, but I'd like to say that this has been in development for a little over a year, and the last year has been a very difficult year for our industry and for everyone, and it's been we haven't got had the opportunity to have much feedback from people just because of issues with the company. So we are very interested in feedback from everybody, including TDs. It doesn't have to be artists, can be TDs, TAs. Very interested in feedback from you guys about how the tool is working for you, what features you want to improve or change or add. Please give us that feedback. We're actively developing this system. We're actively changing it. So it's a good time to get that feedback in. Terry?
Yeah, that's well said, Jonathan. I would say definitely first go grab the Nuke 16 or 15.2 open beta. And what I would do is think about, you must have just two shots on a previous project you worked on. And look at those comps and know it's going to be a super organized Nuke script, and think about how you would approach this using Multishot. And then, it doesn't have to be the full-on version, but begin to build it out, take those same footages and start to use the tools that are in Multishot, the variable switch, variable groups, adding your own variables. And you'll start to, it is actually satisfying at the end of the day when you have this script that is quite smart because of the variables you set up. And then when you're switching states, different things happen within the script. It is a lovely, and then you'll get hooked, and then you'll continue to push it further and make things a little bit more complex. It's a great way to just to get into it. Start with something simple, and then the ideas will start coming.
Awesome. Jonathan, Terry, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you to get like really insights into how the thought process behind it is, but also to have a very practical example, and at the same time can ask a little bit about how this works. I think it's probably, Jonathan, you're probably also curious how people will use it. Sometimes, you create something and then people end up making something completely different out of it. This is kind of Murphy's Law a little bit to some degree here going on. So I think it will be interesting in the next 1 to 2 years to see how this will be integrated, and also maybe people come up with a little bit with copycat similar, like maybe people come up with ways to use it that was not originally thought out, but now they have something that they can expose to and use it. But I think at the end of the day, it definitely gives opportunities, and I'm interested and curious how it will be kind of used in the industry, basically.
I welcome you to join us live and also watch the previous episodes, and I'll see you on our next TT Meetup.